Welcome to this trip through one of the scariest cases in U.S. history. We're going to look into a secret that has been open for more than 100 years. Put to rest in the dark Virginia woods. Tell us where you're watching from and if you know about the Appalachians' dark secrets that they have kept hidden since 1902. In that year, the hilly area of southwest Virginia was so far away that most people had forgotten about it. Communities lived spread out. There were deep valleys and peaks with lots of trees, and in the morning fog, narrow, dangerous paths were hidden. It was known for the hard lives of the people who worked in the coal mines in Tazewell County, which was in a remote place close to the border with West Virginia. Families there had to rely on each other to stay alive because the closest town with medical supplies or good officials was hours away by horseback. It all started in the spring. When it rained nonstop in April, the dirt roads became very dangerous, mud. It went from being very cold in the morning to being very hot and muggy in the afternoon, making the air feel heavy and like something bad was going to happen. One traveler arrived at the small town of Burke's Garden at that time. It was in a circular valley ringed by mountains that some people called the world's biggest hole. He said his name was John and that he was a spice and textile trader from North Carolina looking for new places to sell his goods. The man was about 35 years old and carrying a worn-out leather bag. They were dressed in simple, clean clothes. In the guest books, his name was written as Thomas Whitmore, and he spoke with a clear accent from the coastal plains. Thomas went to remote farms for 3 days, selling things and talking to the people who lived there. Later, people who saw him said he looked nervous and kept looking over his shoulder as if he thought someone was following him. An old woman who bought fabric from him said that Thomas asked about other ways to get through the mountain ranges, especially less well-known routes that went to Tennessee. Thomas Whitmore woke up on April 23rd and left the boarding house he was living. He paid his bill with silver coins and told the owner he was going north to Bland County. He had his suitcase, a canvas backpack, and a big bundle that was tied with rope on his back. He was lost in the mist coming down from the mountain as he went down the winding trail that went up the mountain. The sky was full of dark clouds. No one saw Thomas Whitmore after that, alive. After 2 days, a local farmer found something scary while walking along a side path to check on his hunting traps. He found Thomas's leather suitcase left next to the road about 5 miles north of Burke's Garden, in an area called Garden Mountain. It was open, and the things inside were all over the wet ground. There was a mess of colorful fabrics, broken spice jars, and wet papers that looked like either a fight or a desperate run, but the trader wasn't to be found. The farmer, a man named Elijah Morton, who was 52 years old, went back to the town right away to tell everyone what happened. A group of 15 guys was put together to search the area. They looked through the thick trees by following narrow paths and going into deep gorges where the sun barely reached. They yelled Thomas's name for hours, but all that came back was the sound of their own voices coming from the rocky mountain walls. It was hard to see because of the fog, and the rough landscape made it hard to take any steps. Something happened in the evening of the second day of looking. Something even scarier was found. About 2 miles from where the suitcase was found, in the exact opposite direction of what Thomas would have done, hunters found strange marks in the soft ground near a stream. The tracks were deep, like someone had run or been pulled. The lines went all the way to the water's edge and then stopped. Nobody had crossed, left tracks on the other side, or done anything else that would have shown where they had gone. It looked like Thomas Whitmore had been sucked up by the ground, or mixed with the hazy air in the Appalachians. Over the next few days, the search got even more intense, but each new clue added to the puzzle of where Thomas Whitmore went. One of the searchers found something on the 3rd day that really scared him. About 3 miles from the creek, a torn piece of cloth hung from a low branch of a tree that was hundreds of years old. It matched the merchant's shirt exactly when he left the boarding house. Something dark was on the fabric. Because it is always humid in the forest, it is hard to say for sure if that was mud or dried blood. Even more disturbing was the fact that the fabric was connected at a high level. It would have been impossible to reach the branch on foot because it was about 8 feet above the ground. For that to happen, someone would have had to be running really fast, trip, or be being chased. Or maybe, and this was a scary thought for the searchers, the fabric had been put somewhere else. It was meant to be there as some kind of macabre signal. Elijah Morton, who had found the first bag, started asking other people in the neighborhood about strange things that had happened in the past few weeks. At that point, a scary story began to take shape. On the night of April 23rd, just after dark, a young woman who lived in a house in the woods near Garden Mountain said she heard screams. She said the sounds were desperate and high-pitched, and the way they echoed through the mountains made her lock all the doors. Seeing. She said she hadn't told anyone about it before because she was afraid they wouldn't believe her because people often thought strange sounds in the mountains were made by animals or the strong wind blowing through the valleys. Abraham Cole, a 60-year-old lumberjack who lives in the area, said he saw strange lights moving through the bush that same night. He got back late from delivering lumber and saw what he thought were 3 or 4 flashlights moving in a line. Through the trees, about 500 yards away. It looked like the people moving were on purpose, like they were looking for something or someone. Even though they were so far from people at that time, Abraham thought they might be hunters who only came out at night. These stories brought up a scary possibility. Thomas Whitmore might not have been hurt in a simple mountain accident. The area has a history of thieves who sometimes attack travelers who are traveling alone, taking advantage of the lack of security and difficulty for officials to find them. When guarding these faraway places. Attacks usually happened on major roads, not on secondary trails where not many people went. Also, known thieves left their marks, stole valuables, and rarely tried to hide a body completely. William Blackwood, the sheriff of Tazewell County, finally got to Burke's Garden a week after the murder. He came with 2 deputies and said he would do a full probe. Blackwood was 48 years old and was known for taking things step by step. Thought he was slow to come to a decision. He started by talking to everyone who knew Thomas Whitmore and carefully writing down everything in a black leather notebook that he always had with him. During these interviews, interesting information about how the merchant behaved in the days before he went missing came to light. William Thomas got a letter 2 days before he went, according to Harold Meadows, the owner of the boarding house. The letter came in the mail once a week from. It's somewhere in the east. Thomas read the letter in his room and then burned it in the fireplace. Meadows thought this was odd at the time, but didn't ask him about it. When asked if he remembered anything about the sender, Meadows closed his eyes and tried to picture the package. He only said that it had a postage stamp from Richmond, Virginia, which is the state capital. When the sheriff looked at the boarding house's registration book, he found another strange thing. Thomas had signed up as a North Carolina dealer. But when Blackwood sent telegrams to officials in that state asking about a businessman with that name and description, they all said they didn't know of any. In North Carolina, no one seemed to know Thomas Whitmore or have a business license with his name on it. It seemed like the man had just popped out of nowhere with a fake name made up just for that trip through the Virginia mountains. This new information changed the study in every way. Who was this if Thomas Whitmore wasn't who he said he was? Really, man? The more important question is why he picked that spot and that time to be there. Sheriff Blackwood started to think that the disappearance might not have been as random as he first thought. Thomas may have been on the run from someone or something, and those remote mountains were a safe place to hide for a short time, but they turned out to be a trap that killed him. As the days turned into weeks, Sheriff Blackwood's investigation began to show more and more complicated parts of the crime. Around the middle of May, when wildflowers, as bright colors covered the Appalachian valleys, a new clue came up out of nowhere. A miner who was working in the digs near Pocahontas, which is in nearby Tazewell County, came to the station with an interesting story. Daniel Frost was 39 years old and had worked in the mines for more than 20 years. He said that in the first week of April, a few weeks before Thomas Whitmore went missing, he had met a man at a nearby pub who matched the missing person's description to a tea store owner. But Daniel remembered one important thing very well. The man wasn't by himself. He was having a deep conversation with two other people at a table in the back of the business. The conversation seemed tense, but they kept it low to avoid drawing attention to themselves. Daniel remembered this meeting only after reading an ad in a local newspaper that the sheriff had paid for that offered a prize for information about the missing person. The miner said that the two friends were middle-aged guys, dressed in better clothes than the average worker in the area. One had a scar that went from his head to his jaw on the left side of his face. One wore a dark felt hat and smoked pricey cigars which filled the room with the strong smell of foreign tobacco. There was a whole new way to look into this after getting this information. Sheriff Blackwood began looking for records of foreigners or other strange guests who had been through the area during that time. The records of hotels, boarding places, and taverns were looked through by him. Around Burke's Garden by 30 meters. The work was hard and took a long time, but it paid off in the end. He found names that interested him at a small inn in the town of Bluefield, which is close to the border with West Virginia. Between the end of March and the beginning of April, two guys had stayed there. They signed up as representatives of an investment firm in Boston, Massachusetts, that was looking for coal mining options. The names in the book were Marcus Bentley and Jonathan Crawford, and the innkeeper gave details about each person. Matched the guys Daniel Frost had seen at the pub with the man who they thought was Thomas Whitmore. What was even stranger was that they left quickly on April 24th, exactly 1 day after the merchant went missing, leaving some of their clothes behind and not paying the full bill. The guard, a big man named Patrick Sullivan, remembers both of them well because they had left an impression. Bentley, the man with the scar, spoke with a European accent that Sullivan couldn't quite place. It sounded like German or Dutch. Crawford was quieter. He would write in a notebook for hours on end and rarely join in with the other people at the inn. Both of them got regular mail, but it came through private carriers instead of snail mail, which Sullivan thought was strange but didn't question at the time. Blackwood quickly called the Boston police and asked them for information about the investment company and the two guys. Sometimes it takes weeks for replies to come, and when they do, they bring bad news. No money spent. The men's names were used to start the business. The names Marcus Bentley and Jonathan Crawford did not match up with any known Bostonians who worked in finance or mining. Like with Thomas Whitmore, this time the names turned out to be fake, carefully put together to hide real goals. At the same time, the search for Thomas Whitmore continued in person, on and off. On the weekends, groups of volunteers would still roam the mountains, looking for caves and ravines that had not been explored before. There were many hidden places in the thick woods of the Appalachians where a body could stay hidden for a long time. The rocks had deep cracks, some tens of meters deep, that were hidden by plants so well that you could hardly see them until you were right on top of them. Early in June, on one of these trips, the searchers found something that made them wonder about other things they didn't know. Authorities found the fragments of a body in Wolf Creek, which is about 8 miles from where the suitcase was first found, lately at a campfire. The spot was very hard to find because it was surrounded by rocks that blocked any trail from seeing it. Marks in the ground and the amount of ash that had gathered around the campfire showed that at least 3 people had camped there. What was really scary about that find was what was partly burned in the ashes, pieces of paper with handwriting on them. The fire made it impossible to read them all, but some words could still be seen. It was clear that one of those words was Richmond, the same place where the strange letter that Thomas Whitmore got came from. A hill was the next word that could be read, followed by numbers that were burned too far to read. It looked like part of a hand-drawn map was also there. It showed what looked like mountain tracks or routes. Finding the Wolf Creek camp changed everything about how the case was being looked at. Sheriff Blackwood spent days looking at the burned pieces and trying to figure out what else might be hidden in them. Those ashes. To help with the research, he called a document expert from Roanoke, which is about 60 miles away. The expert, a careful man named Theodore Winters, came with special tools and spent hours making a list of every piece of paper that was found. Theodore was able to figure out that the papers were burned for a reason and quickly. The rough edges and spread ash on the papers showed that they had been thrown into the fire quickly, maybe because of something coming up. A threat or an immediate need to get rid of proof. Besides that, he noticed something odd about the ink. It was the kind of high-quality paper used in law firms and banks, not the kind you usually find on personal letters or simple business papers. Although Theodore was working on the pieces, Blackwood chose to continue his research outside of Tazewell County. He started looking through newspapers from other Virginia towns for cases like this one, or any mention of strange disappearances involving children. Travelers by themselves. The things he found in libraries and old newspapers were both interesting and scary. In the 2 years before 1902, at least 4 stories came in of men going missing in similar ways in mountainous areas of Virginia and West Virginia. All of them were described as businessmen or merchants who were going alone. All of them were last seen in remote places, and no bodies were found in any of them. The people who went missing were found in several counties, months or even years apart, which revealed why the events had not been linked before. The first case that was written down happened in Giles County in October 1900. A man named Samuel Porter, who said he was a cattle buyer, went missing after leaving the farm where he had spent the night. After 3 days, his wagon was found empty, with the horses still hitched, but the man was nowhere to be found. The second case took place in Mercer County, West Virginia, in March 1901. Henry Walsh, who D says sells farm tools, was last seen at a fork in the road near the Allegheny Mountains and was never seen again. The trends in the other 2 cases were similar. Men traveling alone whose identities were later found to be fake or hard to confirm. Missing people in remote places where there aren't any reliable witnesses. Blackwood was most interested in the fact that people in the area had seen groups of 2 or 3 men near the places where people had gone missing in 3 of the earlier cases. They were always regarded as well-dressed and not at all like the rural people in the area. Places to live. With this information in hand, the sheriff began to come up with an idea. Maybe Thomas Whitmore and the other men who went missing weren't just mistakes or crimes that happened when they were ready. They might have all been a part of a bigger secret operation that needed to be kept completely secret and sometimes killed people who were getting in the way or were dangerous. But what was this surgery? And who was in charge of putting it together? Answers started to come out of an unpleasant source. An email from Charleston, West Virginia's city, was sent to the Tazewell County Sheriff's Office in July. Robert Ashford was the sender. He was a private investigator who worked for a law company that specialized in property and mineral rights disputes. Ashford read about Thomas Whitmore's case in the newspaper and thought he knew something that could help the investigation. The officer said that he had looked into a number of fraud cases over the past 3 years. Deals involving mining rights all over the Appalachian area. Organized groups were using fake names to get or steal papers that showed who owned coal-rich lands. In many rural areas, deeds were not properly recorded or kept up to date, which led to legal uncertainty. These groups took advantage of this by sending agents who looked like traders, surveyors, or investors to build trust in communities before carrying out their plans. Ashford talked about one of the names that had. The name of a man only known as the middleman kept coming up in his investigations. This man was a mystery who was never seen directly but was always present in every scam. The middleman was said to have coordinated different groups of agents, provided high-quality fake papers, and had ties to dishonest government officials in several counties. Worse, there were reports that people who knew too much or threatened to reveal the operations would just disappear. They weren't there. Accidents in the dangerous mountains or quick moves to other areas were given as reasons. The agent said he would go to Tazewell and give Sheriff Blackwood all of his files. He thought Thomas Whitmore might have been an agent for this criminal group, and that the two men he saw with him, Marcus Bentley and Jonathan Crawford, might have been his bosses or guards sent to deal with the problem Whitmore was in charge of. The letter that was sent from Richmond, the fake, the nervous behavior in the days before the person went missing, and their name all fit a pattern Ashford had seen in other cases involving the network. On an August afternoon, when it was raining, Robert Ashford went to Burke's garden. The mountain summer was just starting to fade, and the air smelled like wet earth and falling leaves. He was 43 years old, thin, and looked tired. His eyes showed that he had been up all night chasing leads that always seemed to get away at the last minute. He had 2 big suitcases with him that were full of papers, photos, maps, and notes that he had made over the years while looking into the crime group he just called the Syndicate. Ashford and Sheriff Blackwood were locked in the station's small office for 3 days, putting papers on every surface, connecting the dots on maps, and putting together a story that was both interesting and scary. Out of those heated meetings came a picture of a criminal group working on a scale that neither of them had thought of before. The gang wasn't just a group of opportunistic thieves taking advantage of legal problems. It worked like a well-oiled machine and had branches that reached from southern Pennsylvania to northern Georgia in the Appalachians. As far back as his research could go, Ashford said it all started in the late 1890s, when the coal mining boom turned remote mountain places into very valuable land very quickly. People who had lived on. Land for generations all of a sudden found that there was a lot of money in coal under their land. But a lot of these people didn't go to school or know how the legal system worked, which meant they couldn't protect their rights. A lot of people didn't know who owned what, especially in places where property lines hadn't been properly marked. The gang saw this as a great chance to make money. They came up with a complicated system with many levels of function. First, they sent out spies who looked like. Traders, peddlers, or traveling preachers were sent to find places where mining might be possible, but where land rights were weak or non-existent. These scouts learned about local families' finances, how well they could read and write, and any weak spots that could be used against them. As far as Ashford could tell, Thomas Whitmore had been one of these scouts. The second part of the operation began once the places were found and mapped. There are skilled forgers who probably work in Richmond, or documents that looked real enough to fool rural land registry offices and local officials were made in maybe even bigger places like Philadelphia or New York. Some of these papers were fake wills, fake deeds, fake powers of attorney, and even fake death certificates for people who were still alive. The fakes were very well made. They used paper from the right time period, the right inks, and even government seals that were so similar to the real ones that they couldn't be told apart without special knowledge. The third, lawyers who were dishonest filed these fake papers in courts, often in faraway counties, so the real owners of the land wouldn't know about the cases until it was too late. These lawyers were paid well, and they got a cut of the money made from selling land to real mining companies that didn't know they were buying it illegally. The mining companies were also victims, but they had a lot more money to go to court, which meant that rural people were often the ones who lost, pushed off land that their families had lived on for decades. Ashford gave Blackwood detailed examples of how the plan would work in real life. In McDowell County, West Virginia, the Henderson family lost 320 acres of valuable land after papers came to light that said the family patriarch, who had died 15 years before, had sold the land to an unknown buyer on his deathbed. The name on the paper looked like it was real. The witness was a real land clerk, and the seal looked like it was real. It took months of research to show that it was all fake, and by the time the fraud was found, the people who were behind it had vanished without a trace. In a different case in Wyoming County, West Virginia, a kind and well-spoken man who said he worked for an investment company convinced a widow named Martha Colby to sign papers that he said would protect her property rights in case of future conflicts. Even though Martha couldn't read, she put her mark on the papers because she trusted the man. Not for months, did she? She found out that she had accidentally given her land to a fake company, which then sold it to a mining company. When Martha tried to stop the deal, she found that the man who had lied to her had never existed under the name he gave her, and the lawyers for the mining company had perfect papers showing that the sale was legal. But the worst thing about the syndicate's work, and the thing that had the most to do with Thomas Whitmore's departure, was what went wrong and what took place. Ashford had found at least 9 cases of people who were involved in the operations but had just disappeared. This included the 4 cases that Blackwood already knew about. Some were stable, like Whitmore, who might have known too much or threatened to reveal the network. Others were landowners who started to ask annoying questions or wouldn't be scared off. Some of them were even honest local officials who started to doubt that the papers they were being shown were real. It looked like this, always the same. Someone would vanish in a remote place, usually while on the road or checking on property. It was never possible to trust the witnesses, and the few reports that did come out always mentioned well-dressed strangers being close. The fact that the Appalachian Mountains are so dangerous meant that the bodies were never found. It was easy for someone to fall into a ravine, be swept away by a flooded river, or get lost in the thick forests and die of exposure. When local investigations did happen, were limited by a lack of resources and power, especially when people went missing across county or state lines. Ashford thought that these issues were the responsibility of a certain group within the gang. He called them the cleaners, because they were hired to get rid of any threats to the business. Based on accounts he had collected from different places over the years, he thought this group might have been made up of 5 to 7 people who moved around the area and never stayed in one place for long. Long time, always giving fake names and cash payments to hide their tracks. The guys Marcus Bentley and Jonathan Crawford were seen with. Thomas Whitmore were most likely part of this group. The officer thought he knew what had happened to Whitmore. Ashford thought Whitmore had tried to leave the operation, or maybe threatened to tell the police about the crime gang based on the pieces of paper that were found at the Wolf Creek camp and the trader's tense behavior in the days before he went missing. The letter, received from Richmond, could have been a call from his bosses asking for a meeting to figure out what was going on. Then Whitmore went to the mountains, even though he knew he was in danger. He may have been trying to talk his way out of things, or planned to run away on his own before the gang could find him. The event at Wolf Creek Camp was most likely the last thing Thomas Whitmore ever did. There, Bentley and Crawford approached Whitmore, away from any witnesses and behind rocks that made the scene hard for casual observers to see. What could have caused the torn cloth to be found so far away? There may have been a fight or an attempt to run. There was no more proof after the papers were burned, and Whitmore was taken to a place in the huge Appalachian woods where his body would never be found. In such rough and wild landscape, there were a lot of options. Even though Ashford's theory made a lot of sense, Blackwood needed proof before he could move. The two men worked together over the next few weeks to make a case that you could show to state or even federal officials. The criminal group they were looking into was much bigger than what a rural county sheriff could handle, and they both knew they would need help from higher officials to break up the group. The first step was to try to figure out who the mystery middleman was that Ashford had talked about. All the hints pointed to Richmond, the capital city of Virginia. That's where the papers were made and where the orders came from. Blackwood chose to go there and brought copies of all the important papers they had gathered with him. It took the train almost a whole day to get to Richmond, which was on the banks of the James River in the eastern plains of the state. Along the way, it went through hills and mountains. 1902 was a big year for Richmond. It still had marks on it from the Civil War, which finished only 37 years ago. But it worked with new energy for business and industry. Buildings with red bricks. Traders, law groups, and banks of all types lived there. It looked like the kind of place where a clever crime ring could hide from everyone. Hidden as just another real business, like hundreds of others. Blackwood was in Richmond for 3 weeks and went to notary offices, courts, and government buildings. He showed the samples of fake papers to officers with a lot of experience and asked them to look for any patterns or unique features that might help him figure out where they came from. What he found out was both. Not fun and exposed. Several police officers agreed that the fakes were very good, but no one could name the individual forger. There were a lot of people in the city who had the skills needed to do that kind of work, but everyone who was interviewed denied any participation and had reasons or reputations that made it unlikely that they were involved with crime. During a casual chat in a pub near the financial district, Blackwood finally found a lead that looked good. A former office worker named Eugene Hartwell, the judge, who had been a judge for more than 40 years before leaving the year before, heard the sheriff and the tavern owner talking about the case. Eugene slowly walked up to Blackwood and asked to see some of the papers he was holding. The old man made an interesting comment after carefully looking at them by lamplight. He noticed that some of the papers had almost imperceptible differences in the way they were written, even though they were said to have been made in different years and by different officials in different countries. How the text is formatted and spaced. Eugene explained that over the years, each clear or recorder developed their own style, with little quirks in how they put information on the page or the words they used for standard phrases. It looked like the papers Blackwood showed were too good and too normal. They looked like they were made by someone following a guide or set of models, not by a group of officials working separately in different places. Even more interesting, Eugene knew a certain error that showed up in more than one document. In many different documents, the same legal Latin word was misspelled in the same way. If someone was forging from a bad template, they would make the same mistake, but real officials who have their own training and references would probably not do it that way. This information made it very likely that all the papers were made by the same person or group of people using the same set of flawed templates. Eugene brought up that. He knew of only one place in Richmond where you could get the tools and supplies you would need to make such high-quality fakes. There was a small print shop on a side street in the business district. Victor Peyton owned it. Officially, the shop made business cards, party invitations, and personalized stationery for lawyers and business people. But Eugene had heard over the years, but never seen proof, that Peyton sometimes did more private work for clients who paid well and didn't ask. Queries. The next day, Blackwood went to Peyton's printing shop. The business was in a narrow 3-story building that was in the middle of a hardware store and a tailor shop. The storefront looked nice enough, with cases showing off beautiful examples of printed work and a small bell that rang when someone came in. Victor Pétain, who was in his 50s and going bald, had ink on his hands and reading glasses on a chain around his neck. He was polite to the sheriff like a professional, but his eyes showed a flicker of fear when Blackwood identified himself. At first, the sheriff asked general questions about the printing company's work. As the conversation went on, it moved on to official documents and the legality of copying government seals and forms. Pétain carefully answered, always making sure to stress that his work was legal and that he never made anything that could be used to commit fraud. But when Blackwood said that he had happened, when Pétain heard that the printing company sometimes did special work for clients who needed to keep it secret, he became visibly tense. The owner of the printing company strongly denied any wrongdoing, but his body language made it look like the rumors were true. Blackwood didn't have the legal right to search the building without more proof, so he did something else. He made it clear that he wasn't interested in arresting Pétain, but in breaking up a much bigger criminal group. If the printer was willing to help and tell the sheriff who was ordering suspicious documents, he could make sure that his small part in the operation was not taken too seriously. It was clear that Pétain was torn between fear of being punished by the Union and fear of being charged with a crime. He asked for 3 days to think about it, and Blackwood agreed. During those 3 days, the sheriff kept looking into the case in Richmond by going to banks where some of the fraud had happened, processed and talked to lawyers who had fought property disputes on behalf of buyers who seemed sketchy. There started to be a pattern that pointed to a small group of people who showed up in a lot of different transactions. One name kept coming up, but it was always in a roundabout way. People said that Walter Grayson was a deal facilitator who put buyers and sellers in touch with each other, knew the right people, and could get things done quickly. He wasn't a lawyer or an official in any way. Position, but it looked like he had been involved in a lot of real estate deals behind the scenes over the last 5 years. Grayson had an office in a building in the financial district and lived in a fancy house in a nice area of Richmond. He was known for often traveling to rural parts of the state, supposedly finding good investment opportunities. After 3 days, Blackwood went back to Pemberton's printing shop and found that the owner was more open to talking, but still wary. Pétain admitted that he had been writing documents for a client for 4 years, who always paid him well in cash and never asked him any questions about the work. The client never used his real name when he talked to people. He always used a fake name. But Pemberton knew that Walter Grayson might be this person based on how he was described. The papers that were asked for were always copies of official forms from different counties. Pétain thought they might be used for bad things, but the money was too good to pass up. Say no. Pétain also said that his mysterious client did not work alone, which was more important. At least twice, the graphic artist saw the man come in with other people who were waiting outside while the client went inside to place orders or pick up finished work. Pétain said that one of these companions had a noticeable scar on his face, which was exactly the same as Marcus Bentley, who was seen with Thomas Whitmore before he went missing. With this information in hand, Blackwood, finally, had a real link between the disappearances in the mountains and the operation in Richmond that made fake money. A secretary told him that Walter Grayson was traveling and wouldn't be back for a few weeks when he went to his office. The sheriff left his business card and a nice note asking to meet up when Grayson got back, but he didn't say what his investigation was about. He didn't want to warn his target before he had all the tools he needed to do something. Before you leave. In Richmond, Blackwood sent detailed telegrams to Ashford and Tazewell and to the Virginia Attorney General, asking that the criminal plot he had found be officially looked into. He gave names, locations, and descriptions of fake documents, as well as links he had found between different cases. The sheriff knew he was up against something much bigger than anything he had ever seen in his job. He also knew that he would need a lot of help from the government to be successful. Backtrip for Blackwood, too. There was a growing sense of urgency and worry in Tazewell. As the train went through long hours of riding, he thought about how complicated and dangerous the situation he was in had become. He watched as the scenery changed from the eastern plains to the rough mountains of the west. The criminal group had a lot of money, connections in many countries, and a history of being willing to kill threats. By writing about his investigations in telegrams and talking to people in Richmond, Blackwood knew that he had put himself in a position to be attacked. In early September, when he finally got to Burke's yard, he saw that Robert Ashford was clearly upset. During Blackwood's absence, the private detective got some disturbing information. 3 weeks ago, one of his friends in West Virginia, an investigator who had been keeping an eye on fishy drug deals, had vanished without a trace. A man named James Rutledge had been looking into a string of shady deals in Raleigh County when he stopped sending in his monthly reports. When coworkers went to find him where he was last seen, they found his hotel room empty and his things still there, but there were no signs of a fight or a planned exit. This disturbing news put a dark shadow over the investigation that was still going on. If the gang was ready to get rid of even skilled investigators who got too close to their work, Blackwood and Ashford had to be very careful. They chose not to meet in the station anymore, office where anyone could come in and watch them work. Instead, they started meeting up in different, less reliable places. A farm in the middle of nowhere here, an old hunting cabin there, always going around straight routes and making sure no one was following them. While they were waiting for Richmond and the Attorney General to respond, the two men kept gathering proof and making connections between more cases. Ashford got copies of land records from land registry offices in 6 different counties. All of the records were strange, deals on real estate that followed the same trend. All of a sudden, papers would show up claiming ownership of valuable land based on sales or inheritances that had never been logged before. Families who were hurt rarely had the money or legal means to fight the claims. And when they did, they were up against well-funded lawyers working for companies that seemed genuine. It was a very clever plan that the syndicate didn't keep the homes for long periods of time. As soon as they got title through, using fake papers, they quickly sold the land to real mining companies at prices below market value that were still good for business. Companies that wanted to grow did some basic due diligence, but the fake papers were good enough to get by with only a quick look. When the scam was finally found, the group that stole the money had already left, leaving the mining companies and the original owners to fight in court for years. Around the middle of October, when the leaves in the mountains first started to change color, in shades of red and gold, Blackwood finally heard back from the Attorney General. Though careful, the letter was positive. The office wanted to start an official investigation because they were interested in the information the sheriff gave them. However, the process would be slow and careful because of how important the case is and the possible political ties that some of the people involved may have. The Attorney General told Blackwood to keep gathering evidence, but warned him not to move too quickly. Could let the targets know or put future criminal charges at risk. This answer was both annoying and easy to understand. Blackwood knew that property fraud cases were extremely hard to solve, especially when they involved people with a lot of money and the ability to hire good lawyers. But every day that went by without action meant that the gang kept working, which meant that more families could be hurt and more people who were in trouble could go missing. It was in this tight wait that an entirely new lead came up out of the blue. At the end of October, a farmer from Bland County came to the police office with a very strange story. In the mountains between Bland and Tazewell counties, he was shooting deer when he found an empty cabin that he had never seen before. The house was old and hadn't been lived in for a long time. It was in a narrow valley with steep cliffs on all sides. But when the farmer looked inside, he found something strange, hidden under loose. He found some papers rolled up and protected by oilcloth on the floorboards of the cottage. Even though they were wet, the papers were in pretty good shape. They had what looked like drafts of property titles, hand-drawn maps of land parcels in different counties, and lists of names with numbers next to them. When the farmer thought he might have found something important, he carefully gathered them all up and took them straight to the police. When Blackwood and Ashford looked at the papers, they were thrilled right away by their find. The papers were clearly working materials for the syndicate. They were probably hidden there as a backup or so spies working in the area could use them later. The maps showed which homes had not yet been targeted by fraud, which suggests that operations are planned for the future. There were landowners, land registry workers, and even local judges on the lists, along with notes that said which ones could be bribed or scared and which ones would be problems that needed to be solved. Gotten around. What was even more telling was that one of the papers had parts of a letter from Thomas Whitmore that had never been finished or sent. The handwriting matched other samples that were found with the merchant's lost things. In the letter, Whitmore said that he was becoming more and more uncomfortable with how the gang was running things, and that he had seen something in the mountains that really upset him. Even though he didn't say exactly what he saw, he did say that the group's actions had gone beyond fraud with documents and into much darker ground. The letter stopped in the middle of a sentence, as if the writer had been stopped or thought it was too risky to keep writing. This finding supported Ashford's idea of what had happened to Whitmore. The merchant tried to leave the gang after learning or seeing something that even a criminal with loose morals could not stand. Because the group didn't want him to go to the police, they had him killed. Bradley Marcus and Jonathan Crawford, the cleaners, had been sent to ensure that Whitmore never had a chance to speak. The abandoned cabin where the papers were found was approximately 15 kilometers from Wolf Creek, where the suspicious camp had been discovered months earlier. Blackwood organized an expedition to explore the area more fully. A group of 10 trusted men scoured the nearby woods, searching for further evidence or any clues as to what had happened to Thomas Whitmore. They found several other abandoned buildings, Old Hunter, cabins or temporary shelters used by travelers, but nothing that offered any major additional information. However, in a deep ravine about 2 miles from the cabin where the papers were found, searchers made a macabre find that finally brought some grim conclusion to the mystery, partly hidden by accumulated leaves and overgrown vegetation. They found remnants of clothes matching the description of what Thomas Whitmore had been wearing when he disappeared 6 months earlier. The clothes were torn and stained, spread over an area of several square meters at the bottom of the ravine. There were no visible human remains, but the nature of the area with its wild predators and natural decomposition processes made this understandable after so many months. The finding in the ravine brought a bittersweet sense of closure to Thomas Whitmore's case, but it also intensified Blackwood and Ashford's desire to completely dismantle the syndicate. The sheriff immediately sent a full report to the Attorney General, including photographs of the clothing found, copies of the papers discovered in the abandoned cabin, and a full analysis of how everything connected. The physical evidence finally gave a solid base for more aggressive legal action. While awaiting action from state authorities, the 2 investigators started to notice subtle changes in the area. Several people identified as possible syndicate agents simply disappeared from their known locations. A guest house in Bluefield that frequently hosted suspicious visitors suddenly closed with the owner citing health issues and moving to relatives in another state. A lawyer in Welch, West Virginia, who had represented questionable buyers in multiple property transactions, closed his office and left without telling his current clients where he could be found. These changes showed that the syndicate was aware that investigations were getting dangerously close to its core operations. Ashford suggested that they likely had informants within government offices or among local officials, people who alerted the organization when major investigations started. The criminal network was shrinking, eliminating its most obvious presences and possibly planning to cease operations in the region, or at least temporarily suspend them until the heat of the investigation subsided. In November, as winter began to bite into the mountains with the first snowfalls, Blackwood got an unexpected visitor. 2 detectives from the Attorney General's office arrived in Tazewell, serious men in dark suits and briefcases filled with legal papers. They had been assigned to take over the formal investigation of the syndicate with authority to work across county and state lines. The sheriff felt a mixture of relief at finally having adequate institutional support and frustration at being effectively removed from leadership of a case in which he had committed so many months of hard work. The state investigators Clayton Morris and Stephen Dalton were competent professionals who quickly showed impressive understanding of organized crime operations. They revealed that the syndicate operating in the Appalachians was not unique. Similar organizations existed in other parts of the country, taking advantage of times of rapid industrialization and land ownership changes to commit large-scale fraud. What made this specific group interesting was its sophistication and the apparent violence they employed to protect their operations. Morris and Dalton spent 3 weeks in Tazewell studying all the evidence Blackwood and Ashford had gathered, re-entering witnesses, and establishing a legal framework for criminal charges. They also brought tools the local sheriff simply didn't have, including access to bank records, the ability to issue warrants in multiple states simultaneously, and connections to federal authorities who could be involved if the conspiracy crossed more state lines. During these weeks of intense work, a more complete picture of the syndicate finally appeared. The organization had been founded approximately 5 years earlier by a group of unscrupulous land speculators who understood that traditional legal methods of acquiring property were slow and expensive. They developed the method of forgery as a more efficient way to gain control over valuable land, initially planning relatively small and isolated activities. However, initial success and substantial profits encouraged them to expand dramatically, finally creating a network that spanned 6 states. The core of the group consisted of approximately a dozen individuals, including the mysterious middleman Ashford had named. This man, whose true identity remained unclear despite all investigative efforts, seemingly coordinated all operations from a secure location, likely in a big city where he could hide among thousands of other residents. He was never seen directly by field agents like Thomas Whitmore, speaking only through intermediaries and carefully routed correspondence. Walter Grayson, the Richmond business broker, was one of these top-level intermediaries. He managed activities in Virginia, coordinating between forgers like Victor Peaton, field scouts like Whitmore, and cleaners like Bentley and Crawford. Grayson also maintained relationships with corrupt lawyers and bribed notary public clicks, ensuring that forged papers were accepted without undue questioning. His place in Richmond society, his respectable home, and his office in the financial district provided perfect cover for criminal activity. Morris and Dalton revealed that they had been discreetly monitoring Grayson since getting Blackwood's reports. They had established surveillance at his home and office, tracked his travels, and started building a comprehensive criminal case. The task was to gather enough evidence not only to arrest Grayson, but to use his arrest as leverage to dismantle the entire network. If they moved rashly and arrested only a few mid-level members, the leaders would simply disappear and reconstitute operations elsewhere under new names. The investigators' plan was to carry out a number of coordinated actions in several places at the same time. They planned to arrest Grayson in Richmond, Peaton at the printing shop, and several people they thought were lawyers in different places. If they could find Bentley and Crawford, they also wanted to arrest them. At the same time, warrants would be carried out to seize papers from homes, businesses, and known storage facilities. The job had to be done quickly and correctly, leaving no time for group members to get rid of proof or let each other know. Because Blackwood and Ashford were so important to the investigation, they were asked to join the operation. The sheriff would be in charge of planning arrests in Tazewell and nearby counties where a few minor players in the plot had been found. Because Ashford knew a lot about how things worked in West Virginia, he would work with the state's officials to carry out similar warrants. The surgery was set to happen on the 10th of December, a Monday when all the buildings would be open and the targets would probably be where they normally work or live. It was also well planned because it wasn't too late and heavy snow wouldn't get in the way of police work. It was just close enough to the hard winter to make escape routes through the mountains very difficult. Blackwood felt a mix of excitement and worry in the days leading up to the planned date. He spent 8 months looking into what happened to Thomas Whitmore and figuring out the huge plot behind it. Finally, there would be some justice, not just for Whitmore but for everyone else who was hurt by the gang. At the same time, the sheriff knew there were risks. If something went wrong, like tips about the planned operation getting out, the crooks could get away or even get back at the police who found out about them. It was hard for Blackwood to sleep on the night of December 9th, the day before the surgery. He went over all the plans in his mind. He made sure his deputies knew what they were supposed to do and worried about all the things that could go wrong. Outside his window, snow started to fall slowly, covering the mountains with a white blanket that seemed both peaceful and ominous. We can only imagine what this rural sheriff was thinking as he got ready for the most important day of his career, the day that would decide whether months of hard work finally paid off, or whether the criminals he had been after for months would get away. Because they were in jail for so long, would again get caught in a broken justice system. It was cold and clear in the morning of December 10th. The snow from the night before, leaving a thin layer on the mountains that sparkled in the sun. Blackwood had been awake since before dawn. He carefully put on his outfit and checked his service weapon 3 times. His 2 deputies were told to meet at the station at 5 a.m. because he wanted to make sure they were set up and ready. The morning before any of his targets started their daily lives, 3 main things were the goal of the Tazewell project. The first was Horace Pennington, who had been the county clerk for 15 years and whose name was on a number of papers that looked fishy. The second was a wealthy farmer named Luther Vance. Blackwood found out that Vance was working as a local spy for the Union, looking for properties that might be at risk and telling his bosses about them. The third was riskier. It was a guy named George Tolbert had been seen several times near missing people and was thought to be a possible cleaner. They arrived at 6:30 in the morning and knocked on Horace Pennington's door. The priest answered when he was still in his nightclothes. He looked surprised by the early morning visit. Pennington's face showed a range of emotions when Blackwood showed him the arrest warrant. First shock, then doubt, then fear, and finally giving up. He didn't fight back. He let himself be. The man was handcuffed and taken away while his wife watched through the doorway with tears in her eyes. Right away, the deputies started checking the house for papers, letters, or anything else that could be used as more proof. After 40 minutes, they found something very strange. Pennington had kept careful records of all the shady deals he had been involved in, presumably as insurance in case he had to deal with the police or to protect himself from his friends betraying him. There were ledgers with records of payments made, letters with clear directions on how to handle fake documents, and even drafts of deeds that had not been used yet. It was a treasure trove of proof that went beyond Blackwood's most hopeful hopes. While deputies carefully packed up the papers that were found at Pennington's house, Blackwood went with another group to arrest Luther Vance. The farmer lived on a large piece of land about 8 miles outside of town. There was a big house with barns all around it, fields that showed signs of years of good farming. The group found Vance taking care of his horses in the barns when they got there. Vance, unlike Pennington, wasn't shocked when the police showed up. His face changed into a resigned, almost relieved look when Blackwood told him why he was there. The sheriff was surprised when Vance offered to help in any way possible before he was even publicly questioned. The farmer said that the union had hired him 3 years ago when he was having money problems. Problems after a string of bad crops. At first, the work seemed harmless. All that was needed was a list of land that could be bought and information about the owners. It was the large payouts that saved his farm and made sure his family was well taken care of. But over time, he came to understand that he was interested in a lot more than just buying and selling land. Vance said that he had thought about calling the police several times in the past 6 months, but was afraid of what would happen. He had seen what happened to people who broke the union or caused trouble. He said that he had heard rumors about Thomas Whitmore, the missing trader, and other people who just vanished when things got awkward. The farmer felt horrible about what he did and was so happy that he could finally tell everyone what he did. The information Vance gave us that morning was very helpful. He knew the names of other spies who worked in nearby counties and had information about how their communication system worked, and, most importantly, it had information about meetings that took place at different places on a regular basis and where field agents reported to their bosses. The next meeting was set for 2 weeks from now at a bar near Princeton, West Virginia, and Vance knew a few of the people who were likely to be there. At the same time that these searches were happening in Tazewell, operations were also going on in other places. Clayton Morris and Stephen Dalton, along with 6 other cops, were in Richmond. I got to Walter Grayson's office at 7 o'clock in the morning, right as he was starting for the day. When Grayson was told he was being charged, he tried to act calm and angry, but his confidence started to crumble as the investigators began to list the crimes they believed he had committed and the proof they had against him. When investigators searched Grayson's office, they found a detailed file of operations that was much more full than they had thought. Grayson had kept thorough records, just like Pennington. Records, but only for one reason. His paperwork showed not only past deals but also what he planned to do over the next 2 years. There were maps showing hundreds of properties in 6 states, names of officials in several counties who had been bribed or were thought to be easy targets for bribery, and letters that showed the whole structure of the organization. The most important thing that the police found was a safe hidden behind wood panels on an office wall. There were not only big things inside the safe, not only cash, but also a bunch of letters and telegrams that were sent back and forth with the unknown broker. The letters used codes and oblique references instead of real names, but they gave important clues about who the organization's boss was and where they were. Recently sent telegrams showed that the agent was in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This city is big enough to provide privacy while still being close enough to the operations to allow for effective control. At the printing shop owned by Victor Piton, the search also produced important outcomes. Many of the forger's work materials had been destroyed in the previous days, which may have let him know that an investigation was going on, but there was still enough proof to go on. Investigators found printing plates that were used to make copies of official seals, stocks of paper that was appropriate for the time period so that documents looked like they were made years ago, and samples of special inks that were made to look like they were aged naturally. At first, Piton refused to help, but when he saw he started to give up when he thought he might spend decades in jail. George Talbert, the alleged cleaner, was living at a boarding house in Welch, West Virginia, when he was arrested. It was the most exciting arrest of the day. When the police got to his room, the door was locked, and no one answered when they called. After breaking down the door, they saw that Talbert had escaped through a window, quickly leaving most of his things behind. A search of the room turned up a troubling collection of things. There are detailed maps of remote mountain areas, lists of names with some crossed out, and a diary with cryptic notes about travels and meetings that seem to match up with the times of several of the disappearances that are being looked into. Talbert's escape was the only major problem with how well everything was planned that day. Authorities all over the region were sent alerts right away with specific descriptions of the man and warnings that he could be dangerous. A lot of roads and train stops were blocked off. Police kept an eye on the criminal, but he or she seemed to have vanished into the vast Appalachian woods, using the same route that the group had used to successfully hide other victims. Around 7 people were caught in 4 states by the end of the first day. There were a lot of people in police stations holding cells, and mountains of papers that had been seized were being sorted and studied. Morrison and Dalton set up a temporary office in Richmond to make sure that all the evidence was handled properly and that work could begin on, making separate criminal cases for each suspect. It was hard to keep track of all the information, but it was also a strong foundation for the charges that would be hard to fight in court. Over the next few days, the business continued to grow. More people were arrested because of information given by the first suspects. Lawyers who had been working for the group were taken into custody. Clerks were charged with corruption in 3 more counties, and a number of small-time spies who had worked as scouts or couriers were caught and put in jail. Layer by layer, the network was being taken apart, showing an operation that was even bigger than Blackwood or Ashford had thought. There was a lot of press attention. Newspapers all over the area had shocking headlines about the huge fraud scheme and the people who went missing as a result. Families who had lost land in shady deals started to come forward. Some, from as far away as Kentucky and Tennessee, talked about similar events. The lawyers for these families started filing lawsuits to get back property, or at least get money for your damages. There were a lot of cases in court that were connected, and it would take years to figure out all of the scams that the syndicate pulled off. But even though the operation was successful, a very important question was still unsolved. Who was the go-between? It looked like Pittsburgh from the clues found in Grayson's office, but there were more than 300,000 people living in the city, and it took years to find someone who had been. Staying in the dark without ever letting anyone know who he really is would be very hard. Morris and Dalton worked together with Pennsylvania officials, giving them all the information they had access to and asking for a full investigation. However, they both knew that catching the group's leader would be much harder than shutting down its field operations. Blackwood thought about the amazing 8 months that had passed while he was in his office on Christmas Eve, reading news and letters about the case. Thomas Whitmore was not seen in those mountains. Even though the mystery merchant was only a small part of something much bigger, his death accidentally brought down a criminal network that had been operating without being caught for years. How many more people would the gang have killed if Whitmore hadn't left when and where he did? How many more people would have lost their land and ways to make a living? This area had a very hard winter from 1902 to 1903, mounts in the Appalachians. The valleys and hills were covered in thick layers of snow that didn't melt until well into the next spring. During these cold months, when nature was resting under its white blanket, the work of breaking up the Union continued non-stop in courts and police departments across many states. The trials began in March 1933 and were held in Richmond because it was in the middle of everything and had all the tools needed by the courts. Walter Grayson was the first person from the group to be charged with plot to steal money, fake official papers, and be involved in suspicious disappearances. Luther Vance, Horace Pennington, and Victor Peaton's testimony, which they gave in return for lighter sentences, was very shocking. Over the course of 3 weeks, the lawyer carefully put together a case that showed not only how big the fraud was, but also how evil and planned the syndicate's actions were. During most of the trial, Grayson insisted he was innocent, saying, to be just an intermediary for honest businesses that had been ripped off by dishonest partners. But the amount of paper proof found in his office was simply overwhelming. His exact records, which he kept to keep his criminal friends from betraying him, were ultimately what led to his guilt. After only 4 hours of deliberation, the jury found the person guilty on all charges. Grayson got 25 years in jail, which was a harsh sentence that fit the seriousness of his crimes. How much pain he had caused many people. Over the next few months, more cases happened, and each one showed more about how the gang had worked. Pennington was given 10 years in prison for his helpful actions, but Peyton was given 15 years even though he had testified, because the judge thought that Peyton's very good fakes were essential to the illegal operation's success. A number of lawyers were banned from practicing law and sent to jail, sentences ranging from 5 to 12 years based on how badly they broke the law and how willing they are to work with the police. Luther Vance got a 3-year suspended sentence as long as he kept helping with the investigation. This was because he cooperated fully and right away and gave honest testimony against other members of the group. The farmer went back to his farm a changed man who felt bad about what he had done and was determined to start over honestly. Many times, in the months that followed, he went to the Blackwood police station and gave more information as he remembered things that could be useful. But what happened to George Talbert, the worker who got away, was still a mystery. Even though there were a lot of searches and a big prize for information that led to his capture, the man just disappeared, just like the people he was said to have killed. Some people thought he might have run away west, maybe even to California or further. Others thought he stayed hidden. They lived under a fake name in one of the many remote towns in the Appalachians where people from other places were rarely asked to keep to themselves. As for the mysterious middleman, who ran the whole business without being seen, no one ever found out for sure who he was. A few possible suspects were found in Pittsburgh, businesses with ties to the mining and land industries. However, solid proof was always hard to come by. Clayton Morris and Mary. Stephen Dalton followed leads for more than a year, going from city to city and talking to hundreds of people. But the man who had planned it all stayed a shadow, a ghost whose touch many people had felt, but who had never been seen for real. Of course, there were ideas. Some people thought the broker knew about the investigations and ran away to Europe or South America before the people were caught. Others thought he might have just quit and started a whole new life under a new name, identity, living happily off the money they've made from years of successful crime. Some people said in whispers that the middleman might not have been a real person at all, but rather a title or post that different people had taken on at different times. It was like a collective persona that kept the real leaders hidden by layers of anonymity. Families who lost their land because of the syndicate's fraud only got some justice when the group was broken up. The ways the law works too. It was very hard to get back the property. A lot of the land had already been sold again, multiple times to buyers who were not involved in the fraud and paid fair prices without knowing about the first scam. The courts had a hard time figuring out how to balance the rights of the original owners with the claims of later buyers who were also victims of the crimes, though not directly. Some families were able to get back their land after a long legal battle. Others got money from funds as settlement. Seized from the gang, and many of them never got back what they had lost. They had to accept that the injustice they had been through could not be fixed by the legal system. After the case, Blackwood stayed on as Tazewell sheriff for another 12 years. He finally retired in 1915 as a respected man whose hard work had brought justice to an area that needed it badly. He sometimes gave talks about the gang case in other places, sharing what he had learned about how to investigate organized crime. Crime in the country. Thomas Whitmore was a mysterious merchant whose absence started it all. The sheriff never forgot about him. He kept a small object that he had found in the ravine where Whitmore's clothes were found on his desk. It was a metal button with initials that didn't match the merchant's name. It kept reminding people that Whitmore was still a mystery, even after he died, because he had lived and died under fake names and kept his secrets with him. Robert Ashford went back to the job he had as a private detective, but the case had changed him in a big way. Over the next few years, he became more and more skilled at looking into cases of property fraud and helping rural families defend their rights against people who wanted to take advantage of them. He wrote a short book about the syndicate case in Wonder 97, not to make money but to teach police officers and landowners what they needed to know. The book was widely read in Appalachian communities and helped people spot the signs of fraud, scams, and stay away from falling for them. The mountains where Thomas Whitmore spent his last days are mostly the same now. You can still see dense forests in the valleys and on the hills. It's still foggy in the mornings, and deep ravines still hold secrets that may never be found. Whitmore last showed up in Burke's Garden, that circular valley surrounded by mountains, before he disappeared. It is still a small, isolated town that hasn't changed much in more than 100 years. Some of the families that lived there in 1902 still have relatives who live on the same land and work the same fields. Their lives are tied to the eternal rhythm of the mountain seasons. There's something very scary about remembering those dark spring days in 1902 when a guy walked into those mountains and disappeared. The technology we have now makes it almost impossible to disappear totally. Cameras and digital records keep track of everything we do. But just over 100 years ago, in the far away, people could just disappear into thin air in the Appalachian Mountains, where the huge wilderness of the mountains and forests swallowed them up. In what other ways do these mountains hide things? There are probably a lot more stories like this one that are lost under layers of earth and time, waiting for someone to find them and tell them. The riddle of Thomas Whitmore, or whatever his real name was, has still not been fully solved, even though we know pretty much what. Whatever happened to him in those woods in April 1902, no one knows the exact details of his last moments. He may have tried to fight or run away, beg for his life, or just accept his fate without saying anything. We're not sure where his body was left in the huge woods of the Appalachians, in what deep gorge or rocky cliff he was laid to rest. We'll never know who he was before he changed his name to Thomas Whitmore, what he did for a living, or what family members were waiting for him. He's somewhere, and they never found out what happened to their loved one. These are the secrets that the mountains are very protective of. The Appalachians are grand and beautiful, but they are also harsh, and don't let people off the hook. Over the years, they have seen a huge number of terrible events happen to people, and stories of loss and pain have seeped into their ancient depths. The case from 1902 is just one of many, though it may be the most complex and well-documented. You can see it to remember a time when the law often came too late, or not at all. When people were brave and determined enough to follow the truth no matter where it went in order for justice to be done. You've made it this far on our tour of one of the scariest cases in U.S. history. You might want to subscribe to the channel to see more videos like this one. Post your ideas in the comments about this strange case about the group that worked in the mountains to find out about Thomas Whitmore and the secrets he took with him when he died. Also, if you liked this, a like will help bring these forgotten stories to the attention of more people who like dark and interesting secrets from the past. Until the next story, don't stop being interested and don't stop asking about the secrets that time tries to hide.